It is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's seminar hosted by the Center for Social and Economic Progress on a very interesting and important topic, understanding the social acceptability of structural reforms. Structural reforms have become more crucial than ever, given the rise in economic difficulties, shifting demographics, and the need for green transition. Yet, gaining public acceptance for these reforms remains a significant challenge. This seminar will focus on how policymakers can overcome these obstacles by exploring the key findings from a chapter of the IMF's World Economic Outlook report. We are honored to have with us three distinguished experts who will share their insights on this critical topic. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nick Sander, Dr. Balima, and Dr. Renu Kohli. Dr. Nick Sander is an economist in the Economic Modeling Division at the IMF Research Department. Dr. Sander has a wealth of experience, having previously served as a senior economist at the Bank of Canada and the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. His research focuses on production networks and understanding the macroeconomic effects of supply shocks. Next, we have Dr. Balima, also an economist with the IMF's World Economic Studies Division. Dr. Balima brings extensive expertise in IMF programs, bilateral surveillance, and capacity development, particularly in the Middle East and Central Asia. Before joining the IMF, he worked at the World Bank, where he focused on macroeconomics and fiscal management. His research has been published in several leading academic journals. Welcome to CSEP. Finally, the conversation will be moderated by Dr. Renu Kohli, a senior fellow here at CSEP. Dr. Kohli's distinguished career spans roles at the Reserve Bank of India, the IMF, and several think tanks, where her work is focused on financial sector liberalization, capital flows, and the macroeconomic impacts of decarbonization in India. Without further ado, I would now like to invite Dr. Renu Kohli to commence the seminar. Thank you.
Okay, I think we can go in straight. Let's start with your presentation. And so, welcome both of you, Dr. Sander and Hippolyte. So, let's just start. Go ahead. Do you want to?
Yeah.
Okay.
I did send the presentations. Yes. Yeah.
Is there a presentation? Oh, there it is. There it is.
Yeah, very good. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction and for hosting us here today. It's really a privilege to be here presenting our latest World Economic Outlook. And my presentation will focus on chapter 3 of a report, which focuses on understanding the social acceptability of structural reforms. So let me just start with some motivations of why we are analyzing the social acceptability angle of structural reforms. This is based on three key facts, I would say. First, global growth has been, going through a prolonged period of structural weaknesses, and medium-term growth under current policies is somewhat weak, with global growth around 4 years from now and projected to around 3.1%, which is quite lower than what we have seen in the past 10 years. And at the same time, policymakers are urged in some ways to, advance on structural reform. And what do I mean by structural reform? It's, revise the rules and policies that shape how an economy works in order to boost productivity, employment, and growth. But implementing structural reform is not without challenges. And this is what I will illustrate in this chart. These challenges. The chart on the left shows basically the regulatory stance in product and labor markets, what we have called EPL, employment protection legislation, in the first part, and product market regulation in the second part of the first chart. And what do we see? We do see from this chart is that in the case of employment protection legislation, which is basically the first part, the regulatory stance has moved barely in 4 decades. And in the case of PMR, the second part, we do see some improvement for advanced economies, but for emerging market economies, we still have some disparities between countries. And meanwhile, if we look at the second part of the chart, we do see that the number of countries experiencing reform-related protests has increased over time, doubling over, I would say, 4 decades. And the increase is particularly significant since the global financial crisis. And this may suggest that securing social acceptability for policy changes is a major obstacle to reform implementation. And in fact, what we see with the last chart is that for 2 out of 3 reform areas that we do focus in our chapter, implemented policies are much more likely to be reversed if the reforms were met with some form of social resistance. And we see that for implemented reforms, they are more likely to be reversed if they have been resisted, the red part of the charts. So inspired by these facts, in our chapter, we ask 3 key questions. Number 1 is, how difficult has it been to implement structural reform in the past? And what are the key factors affecting outcomes? Number 2, what drives individual attitude toward reforms? What is the role of, say, socioeconomic characteristics that in some way reflects individual self-interest as opposed to beliefs and perceptions? And what is the role of, let's say, informations and other beliefs in shaping reform design? And the last question is, what tools, strategies, and institutions can help policymakers to forge a bit the consensus, improve the policy design process, and ensure that reform are not only implemented, but they also endure over time. So let me give you some quick preview of the chapter. We use 3 different methods to address our questions: macro level regressions using a novel narrative database. We also conduct our own survey data and analyze them. And in the last approach, we built on country cases to learn from the past. And in the macro level analysis, we do find that the space of structural reforms are more than half since the global financial crisis, and that the use of communication, consultation, and mitigating measures have been the more reliable predictors of reform implementation. At the micro level, we do show that individual beliefs and perceptions are key drivers of reform implementations as opposed to their socioeconomic characteristics. And we do also find, as in the macro parts, that communication, information strategies, as well as complementary and compensatory measures can help in some way shape the way for the implementation of reforms. And last but not least, we do zoom on the country cases, and the learning from that is that communication is not enough. It's not just about a PR strategy, but it's highlight in some way the importance of trust in both the message and the messenger, the importance of conducting, say, and diffusing policy research that are non-partisans, and a strong institutional setting that facilitate consultation with key stakeholders, including in the policy design stage. So let me start with the historical analysis. When we started this project, we noted that despite the challenge of implementing structural reforms, there is no data that shows the process of reform implementation, where we can observe successful and unsuccessful reform attempts. So to fill this gap, in our chapter, we introduce a novel cross-country narrative database. The data is built by looking at Economic Intelligence Unit quarterly reports and using text analysis based on at large language models, including ChatGPT, to document, I would say, 3 factors that we didn't find in the literature. The first one is to document the policy measures and the reform stage, which is basically when the reform was discussed, passed into law, and also implemented. So we do observe all the whole process of the reform implementations. And we also document wherever the reform faced some form of social resistance during the design process, and if the authorities had in some ways to recalibrate the reform in order to get it passed. We also collected data on wherever the government relied on communication and consultation strategies. That can be some kind of hearing, referendum, or some compensatory and complementary measures. You can think about, say, some job training opportunities, or subsidies, or grandfathering clause in order to pass the reforms. So a closer look at our narrative database, we do observe 3 key facts from the chart you can see here. The first fact is that when we flip the sample into 2 periods, before and after the global financial crisis, we see that the number of reform episodes has declined over time, and almost all of the policy fields and across country group. A second observation also from the data is that how it shows how difficult it has been to pass reform. For instance, only half of the reforms that was discussed have been passed and implemented. And even for the reform that have been implemented, we do see that with the red ones, some of them have faced resistance, and even those who face resistance, a lot of them end up being diluted, meaning that the government has to readjust the plan to get the reform passed. So next, based on that database, we analyze the variability of reform outcome in order to understand what are the factors that can explain the reform success. And for that, we use a multinomial logit regressions where the dependent variable is basically the reform outcome, the process that I mentioned. It takes 0 if the reform was discussed but didn't, get implemented at all. 1 if implemented but resisted or diluted in some way. And 2 if it's implemented, which is basically the ultimate outcome without any resistance or dilutions. So without the regression, with looking at our key variables of interest, which are here, the reform strategy, I mentioned communication, consultation, and mitigation measures, the macroeconomic context, the macro framework, and the political context. And we try to compare the contribution of these factors. And we do find that, consistent with early findings in the literature, the macro context and the political context also matter for reform implementations, but the sign and relevance vary from one reform to another. But more importantly, what we are interested here, comparing the contribution to the variance, we can see with a chart on the right, when we compare the importance of reform strategies to other factors, we do see that reform strategy do play a lion's share in explaining the implementation of reform. By strategy, I mean here the communication and consultation strategy and the mitigations measures. And we do find that these measures account for around 22% of reform implementation. And this is quite high compared to, let's say, the political context, which is about explaining 22%, and the macro context, which is explaining about 16%. So our interpretation from this finding is that the active use of consultation, communication, and mitigation measures has been a more robust predictor of reform implementation success compared to the context in which the reform was implemented. So one can say that this historical analysis is based on, let's say, correlation, because we are not able to, zoom on causality. So in the next part, we zoom on the survey part to further dig deeper into, the different reform strategies that I mentioned, and that helps us also to make some causal statements. So for that, we conduct 2 online surveys to tackle 3 objectives. The objective number 1 is to try to understand the individual level drivers of attitude toward reform. And objective number 2, we do use randomized experiments to test whether informing people about the cause of non-reform, what we call the status quo, or explaining the effect of policies can correct the misperceptions about the reform and lead to more support for reform. And the third objective is to use the experimental setup and the survey to assess whether providing some mitigating measures to those who do not support the reform can in some way improve reform outcome. So we run the survey in 2 surveys, with each survey covering 3 countries, with a total sample of around 12,000 respondents, and this is around 2,100 respondents per country. So our first survey focused on product market reform to increase competition and private participation in electricity and telecommunication sectors. And this survey was run in Morocco, Mexico, and South Africa. And the second survey focuses on policies to facilitate the integration of foreign-born workers in the labor markets. And this survey was run in Canada, Italy, and the United States, and the United Kingdom. So going back to the first objective of the survey, which is basically understanding attitude toward reforms. So what I would highlight here is that people preference can be driven by their socioeconomic characteristic. You think about the demographics, the sector of employment, the income level, the education, and this factor in some way also highlights the economic self-interest. If I am, for instance, employed in the electricity sector, I may feel that losing my job if the private sector has to take the electricity markets. But the attitude can also in some way be determined by other factors, what we call beliefs and perceptions, and those can be related to the sector itself, related to the market economy, the view about the government or trust about the government or private sector. Those beliefs can also be related to how policy works. How do I think that the policy that the government wants to implement will affect outcomes that matter for me, like prices, access, and even, let's say, crime rates in the case of migrant integration. So our objective here is to understand the different role of these beliefs and perceptions as opposed to socioeconomic characteristics, because the beliefs and perceptions in the end can be affected by policy interventions. So here we provide a snapshot of the support for reform, how we measure it. In the survey, basically, we collect the different socioeconomic characteristics of individuals, their beliefs and perceptions, and we do have some treatment effects. We have control and treat it, and in the end, we collect individual support for policies. And for PMR, for instance, the question on support rate as follows. Do you support or oppose allowing private companies to produce electricity, if it's the electricity survey, or telecommunication in your country? And you have to select like from strongly opposed to strongly support. And we do have the same setup for migrant integrations, where we decompose the different policy that we ask the respondents to support. So to test for the importance of the socioeconomic characteristic and belief, we have this regression setup where the left-hand side is the support for reform of the individual I in country C, And we do have on the right-hand side our treatment indicators that I will come back later, the socioeconomic characteristic grouped into different blocks, and also different blocks of beliefs and perceptions. So, so moving to the next slide, we do have in our chapter some detailed discussion on the contribution of the different beliefs and perceptions. I mentioned demographics, we will look at the age and so on. But here I will zoom on the relative contributions of these variables. So for that, we use a dominance analysis which allows us to decompose the contributions of the different socioeconomic characteristics and the different blocks of beliefs and perceptions to understand what are the contributions of each factor in explaining support for reform at the individual level. What we find is that individual characteristics, the socioeconomic characteristic on the first lines, do matter for reform implementations support, but they account for around 6 to 11% of the variability, which is quite low. Indeed, we find that beliefs and perceptions play a large role. Beliefs and perception in the two surveys account for around 80% of the variability. And even, yeah.
Socioeconomic characteristics, what kind? I mean, women, men, poor, rich, and what are the directions? Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so what I mean by socioeconomic characteristics is what I mentioned previously. For the PMR survey, we have the different demographics of the individuals. That could be, for instance, your age, wherever you are a female, wherever you are head of household and may feel that, okay, if I liberalize the sectors, maybe the price may hike and I may have to pay more. And wherever you do have in some way you have children in your household. Those are the demographic. We have variables related to income blocks. Are you poor or are you in the higher tiers of the income distribution? We have variables related to education. We have a political leaning, wherever you are right-leaning or left-leaning. And in the literature, we do find usually that for at least product market reforms, right-leaning are more open to that compared to left-leaning. And in the immigration surveys, we do have the same variables. We do have stereotype about immigrant. When you think about immigrant, what is the top of mind that you have? Is it that maybe they are lazy or they are hardworking? And we code that into different variables to capture in our regression. So, I mean, it's a lot of variables. That's why I'm not zooming on the individual level. But the key point here is to see, okay, these socioeconomic characteristics that in some way reflect your self-interest. Because if you do work in the sector, you may fear losing your job, as opposed to your beliefs and perception, which factor matter the most. And here what we define is that beliefs and perception are key determinant of support for reform. They account for about 80% of the variability in support. And even if when we zoom on the beliefs, we see that knowledge about the policy, that is how you think policy works, and perception about the effect of policy. For instance, do you think that competitions in the product market, in the electricity sector, will lead to better price, better quality, and better access for you or not? Those factors matter the most compared to the other beliefs. That's the key point that we meant to mention here. So we do find that knowledge and perceptions matter than individual characteristics, but we use the experimental setup in our survey to see, since these knowledge and perceptions can be affected by policy, how much can we gain with additional policy support? So for that, we distribute the respondent into different groups, a control group and different treatment groups to test for three main hypotheses. The first one is providing basically information on the cost of a status quo. So for the electricity sector, we provide respondents information, data-driven information on the cost, quality, and access to electricity or telecommunication in the home country compared to the United States. The second information is basically the effect of policies, that is basically using research-based evidence on how competition in the markets, electricity or telecom, affect price, quality, and access in other countries. And in the migrant integration reform, we do provide information on how better integrating migrants affects the labor market, fiscal policy, and crime rate in other countries. And the last treatment is basically testing for the empathy, and we provide some real-life narrative experience of immigrant experience in the labor markets, both in Canada, Italy, and the United Kingdom. And this setup allows us to compare basically the treatment effect by comparing the support for reform in the control group as opposed to the treatment group, and identify if those hypotheses can in some ways increase support for reform. So here too, we give some snapshots of the our treatment. This is basically the one for South Africa. We keep the treatment quite uniform across countries. Only change is the flag of the country and the map. And the status quo read that the cost of electricity is higher in South Africa than in rich countries. South Africans pay 68% more in electricity than people do in the United States. And we also say electricity is less reliable in South Africa than rich countries. About 92% of the companies in South Africa report they face power cut for about 2 hours and 20 minutes each time. We provide the source of the information, and we ask respondents if they want to see the link at the end of our survey to check the information for themselves. And the migrant integration is also the same. We use the research-based evidence to provide information on, for instance, on crime rate, on fiscal policy, and on labor markets. So this slide illustrates the treatment effects that we estimated across the 2 surveys and the 3 hypotheses that I mentioned. Starting with the PMR, which is the first block, the results shows that raising awareness about the cost of non-reform has positive effect on supporting the electricity sector. And we do see that support increases by about 4.5 percentage points. We have some positive effect also in the telecom, but the effect is not statistically significant. Still in the PMR, we do see that when we combine the status quo treatment with the effect of policies, that is how competition affects price, quantity, and access, we do see that support for reform increased quite significantly. And this is an increase of about 16 percentage points compared to the control group. For the migrant integration policies, we do see that all the 3 treatments have some positive effect on support. What we did differently compared to PMR is that we do have separate treatment where we explain only the effect of policy, and another treatment where, in addition to the effect of policy, we explain the mechanism behind it, like how integrating better migrant affect crime rate, affect the fiscal policy of the receiving country. And we do see that the most effective approach in the migrant integration policy is not just about informing participants about the effect of policy, but also explaining the mechanism behind the effects. So we also assess in our survey the mechanism behind the support for policies. Is it because respondents revise their beliefs about the policy? And indeed, we do find that this is the case. For PMR, we do find that those who receive the status quo plus effect of policies update their beliefs about the effect of competition on price, quantity, and access. And we do see also that for the migrant integration policy reform, those who receive one of the effect of policy treatments increase the belief that integrating better migrants have positive outcome for native jobs, public finance, and crime rates. So next, we use our survey designs to see how the other part of the our respondent who do not support the reform after our interventions, what is the reasons behind the non-support, and also assess if we can some way buy in more support by complementing with mitigating measures. So in our survey, we use the survey to in some way assess the reasons of non-supports. We group the reason for non-support into personal reasons, wherever you think that it's affect yourself. For instance, because of the price you pay, the quality you get, or you may lose your job, or wherever you oppose the reform because of societal reasons, because the poorest may lose access, or private companies may in some way cut access to remote areas. And we do find that across both surveys, as you can see with the blue bars, societal reasons play the largest roles in explaining respondents' reasons for opposition. For instance, if we look at the PMR, we do see that the most important reasons is affordability for the poorest, and in the case of migrant integrations policies, respondents do oppose and make the argument that it's not fair for natives to help migrants when natives don't have jobs or are suffering. But most importantly, in the second part of the chart, the yellow and red ones, we do introduce some complementary measures. For instance, in the case of PMR, one of the complementary measures is having a regulatory agency that would safeguard cost and quality of utility services if a private company takes the sector. And we do see that across the different...
You have many more slides? We're running out of time.
Okay, I will go really quickly now. Yeah, okay. So we do see that across the different surveys, providing complementary measures increase support by around 50 to 80 percentage points. And we also follow that with those in the red ones. Oops, sorry. How do I go? So those in the red bars, we follow with these guys and ask them why they still not support despite the mitigating measures. And we see that one of the key reasons highlighted by these respondents are trust in the party involved and the lack of trust that the government may be able to implement the right policy. So we complement this with some country cases. We look at employment protection legislation, which is the one with a lot of step back in many countries. We look at 11 cases. I will not go through them here. But what we did learn from these country cases is that building consensus matter for passing the reforms, and building consensus require in some way communicating through research-based evidence through, let's say, institutions that are non-partisans about the need for reform. That can be the passive way. You pass the reform, you pass the information by saying what is the status quo. And this could be through active ways by having like some kind of strong electoral mandate for reform, using some extensive communication with stakeholders, or using pilot case to show the need, the importance, or the value added of the reforms. And sometimes it's required some multiple reform effort through different government to pass the reform. We do find that the policy design also matter. And in that case, it's required some negotiation agreements, some complementary measures, as I mentioned. And last but not least, implementation also matter. And the implementation required a strong institutional setup, some kind of incremental implementations, sometimes starting with small steps rather than trying to implement all at once. So let me just summarize quickly the finding of our report. We've defined in our analysis in the historical past that passing reform has been challenging, but the context in which reform matter, but more importantly, the active use of reform strategy is a key driver of reform implementation. Number two, we do find that beliefs and perceptions matter more than individual self-interest. And number three, effective use of communication and consultation strategy can correct individual misperceptions about the reform and help to pass those reforms. And last but not least, building consensus is key. And part of this consensus building require explaining the need for reform, having an open dialogue with a two-step dialogue between the messenger and between both parties, and also designing the reform with some careful mitigating measures, all built in the context of trust, which highlight the importance of governance reform. I will stop here, and thank you for, sorry for running.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting, and I must comment and appreciate the topic of choice and the fact that the fund has gone beyond structural reform prescription, defining out exactly how to make them more palatable, and couldn't have been more opportune a time, because we're seeing so many countries in trouble nowadays and facing a lot of social unrest because of structural adjustment reforms that have to be undertaken in some of these countries. So without much more ado, I thought that there would be some interesting points for discussion. One of the things that struck me was that the choice for the reforms, electricity, communication, but other than that, the extension of the working age, which is related to aging, a fundamental force which is slowing down growth in the advanced economies, and immigration. Both the last two are issues which are fundamental factors pulling down growth in the advanced countries. And I would say it would be reasonable to say that they are less relevant as reform issues in the lower to middle income economies. So in that context, what advice would you have for the lower and middle income countries in that regard? And also closely related to that is the issue that I can see, again, one can argue this, which is that it's more palatable to sell or to, obtain buy-in for immigration. Say, for example, because it lowers wages and the prices of services, given that in the advanced economies, the composition of demand is so dominated by services. So do you think the composition of demand matters in the context of structural reforms? It would be nice if you could shed some light on this.
Okay. Thank you so much. Can I go ahead?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
It's a discussion. So
yeah. So thank you so much. These are quite relevant points, I would say. So let me take a step back to explain, why we did focus on this product market reform and migrant integrations. When we started the project, we sent a survey to country teams at the fund, all the 190 countries. And we asked country mission chief basically to list the most important reform that they do think, if these reforms have been in some way tested by the authorities in terms of implementation, and wherever those reforms have faced in some kind of backlash, resistance in this sort of protest or so on. And based on the result of a survey, we do see that at least for low income and emerging markets, product market reform most likely, most of the time related to electricity and electricity sector come first on top of mind for the mission chief. That's why we did select product market reforms. And it's, I would say, when one look at, let's say, IMF reports, this is kind of a repeated policy discussion that comes in top of mind, even in low-income countries. As part of the RSF, for instance, we could discuss specific reforms for electricity sector reforms in low-income countries. So I would say it's quite relevant for low-income and emerging markets. And I would even argue that the recommendations that we make in our report goes beyond the two reforms that we do cover. Because it's not just a one-step approach. It's, let's say, it's required some kind of multi-steps approach. That's, I mentioned the communication, I mentioned mitigating strategies that can apply to reform that we would say it's in some way very resistive, like energy sector reform, where we have to remove subsidies and people may, come out and protest. So those mitigation strategies explaining how the reform work can help. And I would say those advice would also apply to middle income countries. And in terms of composition of demand, it's true because migrant integration policies, of course, may be depending on the skill set of the migrants, they may affect some specific sector of the economy. And we do find in our report, for instance, that low-skilled workers, for instance, are more likely to oppose migrant integration policies because they fear of losing their jobs. And we do find also that when we complement with the mitigating measures, those low-skilled workers are more likely to slip and move to supporting the reform. So I would say that, okay, demand matter, but mitigating measures can in some way tighten the balance.
So this power of narratives and the idea of beliefs and perceptions is a very interesting and very attractive one. And it's a very interesting finding that this sort of outweighs the effect of macroeconomic conditions and business cycles. So does this finding not contradict the observation that you said at the outset, pointed out that the pace of structural reforms has slowed after the global financial crisis, a period in which is marked by not just by slowing growth, but a rise in inequality, the rise of populism, higher trade protectionism. So the two sort of are contradictory. So any views you have on that?
That's a good observation indeed. I should note that the two analyses are kind of, a bit separate, because the macro context, we can compare the pre-financial crisis and the post-financial crisis. But in the survey setup, since we ran the survey in 2024, of course, we cannot have like the two episodes to compare.
You can also put it in a way like turbulent versus tranquil times, or boom versus crisis.
Yeah, maybe if we have done the survey in the post-pandemic, before the global financial crisis, the result would have been different. But I think it's broadly consistent with the literature using survey. We do have some studies with other people in academia looking at beliefs about climate change, beliefs about tax policies, and more broadly, they do find that beliefs matter more than individual self-interest.
Okay. Now that since we are having this discussion in New Delhi, I cannot resist and your chapter has also, often referred to India in the context of narratives like the BJP's campaign in 2014 general elections, and also the labor laws reforms and so on. So I cannot resist the temptation to elicit some
comments from you on 2 or 3 aspects. One is, of course, the power of narrative and how they can push buy-in, because although your report is right in pointing out that it may have encouraged buy-in and acceptability of structural reforms, yet if you see the decade after 2014, and particularly the first tenure, one of the things which was standing out at the time was two things. One was the Food Security Act, because that directly impacted the budget, and it sort of fixed food subsidies in a way that introducing more rigidities in rectifying the fiscal imbalances than otherwise, which is counter to structural change. And the second was this land acquisition bill in 2013. So both the NFSA, Food Security Act, and the LARA, as it's called, were supposed to be modified or done or not done in. But we found that that has not happened. The third thing was that privatization, particularly of the banking sector, that eluded too. The only reform which followed 3 years later was the first one was the GST, which was already on the anvil even before 2014. So I do not see any correlation between narratives and narratives like by the political class, and any correlation between acceptability of structural reforms. We come down to the labor laws and labor legislation, and there is a long discussion about it in your chapter, and it says that building consensus matters. I agree with that, and but it's been more than a decade, and this, as the chapter also points out, it happened in 2020, and we are now in 24. And yet we find that the appetite is just not there. And it's less to do with the resistance, but more to do with paying the political price, which often happens. So, these are things that I just wanted to point out. And if I may, or maybe we can leave another one, but there is something which is about reversibility of reforms, which is also that the chapter has pointed out about how less than full implementation or sometimes reversal altogether. Now, India for a long time, from 1991 reforms, has characterized by gradual reforms, but irreversibility. And perhaps for the first time in the last few years, we have seen two kinds of reversal. One is the reversing of it's the pension reforms, right? Moving from the defined benefit to defined contribution. And there has been a reversal in the sense that many state governments promised that they do away and revert to the old pension scheme. And that has caused pressure upon the government of the day to actually modify the existing new pension scheme to have introduced a bigger component of defined benefits, right? Almost 50%. Now that to me ties in with your finding about mitigation measures, which are very important. But then there is a contradiction because you can offer compensatory or mitigation measures only insofar or only to the extent that your balance sheet allows. And if you have a tight constraint, which is very often the biggest structural adjustment reform, which is spending cuts or raising taxes, which are equally unpalatable. So we have seen that. The second one is actually very interesting. If you compare, because you say that the IMF was urging structural reforms to India between 2012, 2013, 2014, it is in the context of labor reforms. But one of the biggest reforms at that time was pass-through of fuel price revisions, right? Now, in 2012, if I remember correctly, inflation was more than 10% in India. And even at that time, with a very high rate of inflation, the government of the day, under the structural reform or, rectification of fiscal balances, was passed on 50 paise per month. But nevertheless, it contributed to inflation. And now, if you rewind back and come back to 2022-24, inflation has been just like it has been above target, I'd say, but 4% plus minus a band of 2% percentage points. But then it was like 6.5% to 7%. But since May 2022, we have seen no fuel price revisions. And so, whether it's under recoveries of the oil companies, which are public sector, or absorption at the budget level. But the fact is, this is also a kind of a reversal. And yet, we find that there was a lot of furor in 2012, and in 2022, because there is another reform, which is that of price stability and inflation targeting. So those kind of issues have not surfaced. Now, both are examples of reversibility. So any thoughts you have on that?
Okay, those are, really good points. I will group them into three. The political price mitigating parts, where you have like some kind of constrained fiscal space, and the reversal. On the political part, I mean, we did indeed look at the India labor market reform. And you are right, I mean, it took like around 6 years, multiple governments to just pass the reform. And even once passed in 2020, it's still not implemented. And I think India is also a very specific case where you have different labor unions, maybe fragmented and with, some kind of difficult negotiation. And you also have the two steps that some countries don't have. Is have the central government, and you need to pass the reform at the local governments. And that's also some kind of complexity in the political, in passing the reforms. One thing I should recognize we didn't do in this chapter is looking at, let's say, well-interested parties that have like some kind of specific interest in the reform and may end up pushing the reform not to be implemented. We didn't look at specifically into that. What we do have in part of the survey analysis is that we do have people working in utility companies. Those are the guys that may be affected directly by the reform. They're, the first persons that may be affected. And what we did find indeed that these persons tend to oppose the reforms, but once we introduce some complementary measures, it's helped by in some kind of reform support. But I do agree that the political context, if we don't have a political buy-in, passing the reform is much more complex. On the fiscal space side, maybe 2 points. One is that some of the mitigating measures that we highlighted in the reports, they can even be passed without, let's say, in the context of constrained fiscal space. Like I did mention that some of people who didn't support the reform even after mitigating measures, they mentioned the lack of trust, and that's related to first generation governance reforms. And those are the kind of reforms that if there is a political will, it can get passed even under a fiscally constrained environment. And other mitigating measures like introducing a regulatory agency that is independent and has, let's say, the capacity to regulate the sectors. Those are, let's say, not fiscally constraints reform that can be passed. And last point I want to say on that is that sometimes, I mean, there is a trade-off because we need to compare also the, let's say, the payoff of a reform as opposed to what the reform costs. And that's, balancing acts need to be done, I would say, even in a fiscally constrained environment. Otherwise, you end up stuck in a situation where, of course, you then implement reform, you have low growth. And of course, you have low growth, you affect your fiscal accounts and you cannot move on. So that balance need to be found in some way. And of course, I cannot, agree more on the needs to sustain the reform through multiple governments. If there is some kind of political competition where one reform gets passed and the next government come in and reverse it back, of course, it's a game of chicken and eggs, and it doesn't lead to to good outcome, I would say.
So one last topic before I open the floor for discussion. So based on the understanding from your research and the insights that you've obtained, would you like to comment on, again, an example from India? In 2020, the government unveiled a host of reforms in the agriculture sector related to marketing and so on. Liberalization of markets, connecting the supply chain directly, and eliminating the role of several layers of traders between the wholesale and the retail level. And yet, after almost 2 years of agitation and resistance, the government had to take it all back. So how would you look at it from, I mean, was it poor policy design? Was it lack of building consensus? Or how would you look at it, assuming that this instance has been studied in the course of your research?
Yeah, I must agree that this is a context I'm not very familiar with, so I may not comment that much. But what I can relate into our chapter is that the engagement need to be done in the policy design stage. Like if you come and sell the product without people being part of the product designs, that can also lead to bad outcomes. So engaging people early on in the policy design could be some long negotiation and discussion if you have a fragmented, say, unions for agricultural union, for instance. But it needs to be done to have a buy-in, in addition to better communicating and also addressing with some kind of mitigating measures. But happily, the rest rep is here if
you want to add to that, Renu?
Discussion. Yeah.
Okay, let's have open the floor for discussion. And so how would you like to take the questions, like one at a time as we go along, or you want to aggregate?
We can take a round of questions.
Okay, all right. Yeah, Ravish.
Very interesting. There were 2 or 3 points where I was very dissatisfied. Let me just start with the first. Was this an online survey that you said, right? It would be nice to know, because online surveys are susceptible to a kind of a cohort which tends to be more forward-looking, younger, better educated, and so on. So there's a bias that perhaps might have come up from there. So that's something. Second is, in a sense, you're motivating the result, because from what I understand, you make the point that you give research-backed information, and that makes people change their minds. Why not a film star? What happens if a film star was to go and say this is a great reform, or for that matter, a religious leader? Right. So yeah. So I don't know, what's so great about research here, right? I mean, it's something that we believe research matters. So we ask a question and people change their views. Perhaps the film star matters more, right? Third issue, and this essentially has to do with in India, I mean, essentially this follows from what Renu said. Till very recently, there's almost been a consensus that you have reforms by stealth. If you go ahead and you start talking to the labor unions, who, by the way, are a very small segment of society, right? You start to talk to them, you've just opened your cards, you're just going to make it very messy. So it's better to not talk to a very small segment, which, by the way, is not only true of labor unions. Generally, all reforms are resisted by a small cohort of people, and the beneficiary are much larger segment. So conceptually, to me, it seems reforms by stealth makes far more sense than reforms by consensus.
Thank you. Very, very interesting topic, as Renu said. Just a couple of quick questions. One is, we know talk is cheap. So when you said respondents' belief about societal impact matters more than their personal loss or gain, I mean, if you interviewed me and you asked, well, are you opposing it because it might lose, I might lose my job, or because it might affect the society, I would say, well, I should sound good. And I would answer, well, it is for the society that I'm opposing it, right? So first question is, talk is cheap, right, in this. Second is, in the narrative, right, the chart you had, which alluding to Lavish's point, see, there is no cost element that the research backed, at least the chart that you showed, indicated, right? So if the research says costs go down, outages go down, right? If you reform electricity, then it sounds that it's a good thing, right? I mean, but what about subsidies going down for me, right? If you were to do the same thing in India, in electricity, you will say a section of population will not get subsidies, right? So in the narrative, at least on the research back thing, it was all good things that research showed. But the trade-off reforms are about trade-offs, right? So I didn't see the trade-off part. So just these two questions. Thanks.
Maybe you can respond now.
Yeah, thank you. These are very nice questions. I will start with your questions on the online surveys. It's true that online surveys have their own backdraw, I would say, but we took some really steps to make sure that the survey is of quality. Number one, it was done by YouGov, which is one of the leading companies for survey design. Number two, before even designing the final survey, we did have two pilot cases where just trying to test what works, not the information, but the design of a questionnaire in order to fine-tune. And number three, I didn't mention it, but we do have the quota part, where, of course, we designed the survey in order to make sure that it represents the demographic distribution in terms of income, education, employment, and so on. So that part is kind of well designed and well thought. It took us quite a lot of months to get there. So in the research based, is it maybe Taylor Swift arguments or research on the effect of policy? I mean, I wouldn't go to the Taylor Swift part, but what we wanted to highlight here is explaining how policy works and explaining what is the outcome of policies for people. Because in the end, this is what matters for people, right? If you have to, let's say, liberalize your electricity sector reform, some people may, change their mind because their religious leader tell them to do so. It can be. But most importantly, what is the impact of reform for me? I think that's, in our case, at least in the economic sense, that's what matters the most. And this is what we try to test in our survey. And the third point on consensus, like, of course, small groups usually, if you have, like, let's say, labor unions for fragmented, and you even have small groups, that can in some way leads to not implementing the reform. But what we define also looking at the historical analysis, if you go without the consensus, you are most likely to get backward in some way, to reverse the reform. So what is the ideal strategy? Do you try to pass on in any case without consulting, or and then you end up, reversing back, or do you consult? It may take some time to get there, but you end up having reform that are sustained. And I do think that the second strategy, at least from an economic benefits side, is better, because most of the time, reform outcome, the impact on growth tend to happen over time. If you implement it now and then the next year you reverse it, you end up not having the payoff of the reform. Personal, societal, that's true. But in our survey, it's not that we ask people, do you support for personal or societal reasons? People can tailor their responses depending on how they think. And then in the analysis, we use large language model, for instance, to recalibrate the different responses of the respondents. So that helps us in some way address that part. And also even in we do have in some cases list of reasons, and we randomly assign them to each respondents, the order randomly, in order to make sure that they are not only selecting something that they're happy with, or they want to, be with the norm. And yeah, because of this reform, it's the positive effects like subsidies. Here, it's also depend on the type of reform, right? Here we are looking at electricity sector reform and migrant integrations. But of course, if you do have migrant, if you don't integrate them, of course, the government may end up, taking charge of part of that, but there may be a burden for public services. If they have a job, they will pay taxes and the economy will benefit. That's the message we want to pass. But of course, we do have some projects even looking at other reforms like subsidies reform, where the cost, at least from the respondent's side, is visible upfront, and we are looking into those issues. Stop here.
Who's next? Yeah, so Amshika and Niti. We can start with Niti first, followed by Amshika.
So actually, from my perspective, the conclusions that you draw are actually completely intuitive, right? I mean, we've seen this time and again, and we've emphasized things like trust and building consensus in policies. So I work on health systems. So we've seen it during HIV, malaria. We saw it during COVID again, and it's it's something that we've really disaggregated and been advocating, including the part about actually building this kind of participatory consultative process right at the time of policy design. So I'm actually more interested in the reverse, right? So you focus on particular kinds of reforms, and I'm wondering, what are those policies where actually this is not applicable? Are there any policies at all, any maybe economic or maybe the kinds of policies by stealth, or where it's actually more useful to not be consultative, where it's more a top-down approach is perhaps more effective? And if there are any instances at all like that.
Amshika.
Thank you for your presentation. So I did like 2 missions to Jamaica and Pakistan with World Bank. And I saw that building consensus in a country like Jamaica was easier when they did structural reforms with the Ministry of Finance, for those involved. And they exactly did with engagement, communication strategies, radio, sort of stuff, and writing pamphlets and sort of leaders, business leaders, and they could bring about structural reforms. While in Pakistan, they have been trying to build consensus, like I worked on tax mobilization, a domestic revenue mobilization, but it has been very difficult for sustainability reforms and building consensus. So how building consensus differs from different EMEs, it's very different. What are the factors that affect building consensus in different emerging market economies as well? Thank you.
So my question is pretty simple. Since you have covered so many countries, right? Your online survey, if I understand that correctly, you said 20 countries, right? Was it? No.
6 countries in the survey and around 96 in the macro analysis.
Right. So when you cover 6 countries, right, were you able to contextualize the impact of similar policy, differently in these countries? Because they would still have different, structural issues in each of these countries, right? So how were you able to, kind of map it together and still take care of the contextualization of every, country within the setup? Thank you.
Jump crush, that's the fourth question. I think that may well be the last one, so that gives you time to respond. We'll see if there's
Yeah.
any time.
Thank you for this great presentation. Structure reforms, of course, are not easy. And, it's not only a question of beliefs and, your perceptions, but also it produces, hard winners and losers. And structure reform in the product markets are relatively easier than in the labor market. So what I would like to know from you, what are the major conditions, major preconditions which you believe are important to carry out successful reforms in the labor market? And could you give 1 or 2 examples where those reforms have been carried out successfully?
You have quite a lot to respond to.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. I will start with the first one. That I would say this is basically food for thought. Starting from the top-down approach, I would say it's a bit like the one of the question answer that I gave. The top-down approach can help you pass the reform quickly in some cases. One example is we have seen the yellow vest protests in France, and then the government has to use like some kind of bypass in the law to pass the reform. And now the discussion in the country is, what happened to that reform? And some group may say, okay, if I come into power, I will reverse it. So I would say the top-down approach is not always the good options in some way. It still need to build consensus if you want the reform to sustain over time. It may be some cases where top-down is needed, but most of the cases that we analyze, and in the historical analysis, we did find that building consensus is really part of the game. You did mention Jamaica, which is basically, it's a very case that we celebrate at the fund in terms of building consensus. They have even like the going through a debt restructuring, and they managed to build consensus over time. And comparing it to Pakistan, I will be brief. I think those are quite different contexts, right? The political context in Pakistan is completely different from Jamaica. Jamaica, they were able to have a consensus even between oppositions and the governments, which may not be the case for Pakistan. So I think in that case, the political context, I do see that's the big difference between the two countries. Contextualizing the country, the policies to each country. In our treatments, since we want to compare apple to apple, it's basically, it's important for us, at least for the treatment, to be uniform. What we make differently is, let's say, the data-driven that we do have. If electricity is X% in South Africa compared to the US, it will be different in Morocco or in Mexico. That information we do provide. What we do in the analysis is basically use our background information on country to analyze country heterogeneity and try to explain what are the salient features that drive those results. And we do have that in two working papers that we release with a chapter that I invite you to take a look. So on the key conditions for passing reform and some examples, in the country cases, I mean, we highlighted basically 3 points, basically building consensus, and building consensus. What is key is it's a two-step approach between the policymaker on the one end and also people that are stakeholders of the reform. We did mention the need for communications and the implementation step. And what is key that I want to mention here is that there is not only one key like measure that countries need to take. Sometimes what we did find from these country cases is that they needed to have some multiple strategies, from mitigating measures to communications to engaging people in the early stage of the policy design. And one of those examples actually is Denmark, where even without reforms, they have some kind of multi-party meetings that is happening regularly. You have a government, we have a labor unions, you have other stakeholders, including non-partisan institutions. And they gather to discuss like reform that are under discussion or proposed in order to have like some kind of, let's say, the not only the buy-in of the different parties, but have input from the different parties. And I think that way of doing, engaging people in the early stage is a good example of, how to pass reform.
But how about the role of safety net? Can we really build consensus without safety net?
Well, that's what I mentioned actually in terms of, the outcome of the reform lead to good outcome. And at the same time, I mean, if you don't have safety nets to complement, maybe the reform may not pass. So there is a trade-off to do that. And one example that we did mention in our report is the case of Ireland. They wanted to liberalize, to remove subsidies, but they did have a lot of resistance. What the government did is they implement a social safety net, but not just implementing, they send money to people's account before removing the subsidies. People receive the money in the account before the reform itself. And that in some way helped to pass the reform. So there are some trade-offs, and of course, we need to use different strategies to pass that we did find.
Okay. Yeah, that was a good discussion and a very good presentation, very thought-provoking. And I read the chapter, of course, but it's a great way of sharing your work and insights. I have to admit that I'm still unconvinced that people can be persuaded to be happy to accept that the transport costs will go up, or they will pay higher electricity bills because it directly affects their consumption basket. And no matter how much of a safety net is given or a compensation is given to the poorer people, because I think even middle class or the upper middle class, at least even in the US, doesn't like high prices of fuel. So this is a very difficult one. So I think that brings us to the end of first thing. So we can have a nice hearty round of applause by all of us for Hippolyte and Nick. Thank you very much once again for a very thought-provoking presentation, and also the audience for engaging in so deeply and with such diverse comments on the matter. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
everybody.
Thank you.